Okay, perfect. Yeah, so hi everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. So I'm Sarobidy Rakotonarivo, and I'm an environmental socioeconomist. I'm based at the University of Antananarivo in Madagascar. And today we are joined by three great panelists. I'm going to introduce them later, but first let me give you a short introduction to the film. So as I said, I'm an environmental socioeconomist, and I'm mostly researching the impacts of nature-based solutions such as conservation and forest restoration on communities in Gabon, Tanzania, Kenya, and in my home country, Madagascar. I've done hundreds of interviews with local people on the forest frontier, and my PhD project back then in 2013 was linked to a big research project that studied the link between poverty alleviation and global ecosystem services. And then I moved to Sterling to do a postdoc on conservation conflicts. So I used experimental games and qualitative approaches to study conflicts between biodiversity conservation and food security. And I worked in mostly in Gabon and in Kenya. So we've published many articles on these issues, like the social impacts of conservation. We've also published on land tenure and on the role of trust and social equity in conservation interventions. So we all know that while this audience reads papers and articles, policymakers don't. So that's how we came up with the film. So we needed a better way to ensure that these research results get used in policymaking, and that the voices of local people are actually heard. So the film entitled Voices from the Forest aims to bring the voices of local people at the heart of decisions about tropical forest contribution to tackling climate change. So it explores the way global policies such as conservation, forest conservation, and restoration affect local people's lives. And it discusses implementation challenges, as well as the role and the critical importance of adequate financing in these nature-based solutions. And it also resonates beyond nature-based solutions broadly by really exploring in depth the challenges of implementing these sorts of policy on the ground. So the film is a way to bring local voices in a much more human and personal level. So one of the major aims of our project, Forest for Climate and People, which was specifically founded to deliver impact from all these years of research, is to bridge the gap between policymakers and local communities. So just recently, before we traveled to COP, so we are actually joining you from COP today, we managed to bring the Minister of Environment as well as the ambassador to the UK and over government authorities to travel to the field to visit a small village at the forest frontier to see firsthand local communities' voices. So they've seen the film, but we wanted to bring them to really see and interact with these very local people. So yeah, it was really fun. It's quite remote. They had to travel across the river with this small pirogue that you see here. And the visit was an opportunity for local communities as well to get their voices heard and to even discuss the challenges they live in a much more personal level with these policymakers. And the nice mouse you see here is from so we first watched the film, and then we had like around a big circle discussion And then we had like a role-playing exercise where we explored a few scenarios, and we asked local communities to put themselves in the shoes of the policymakers. So it was really eye-opening and real fun, because everyone got to understand different perspectives, and also to try to get some shared understandings of the issues. And it was really great. We were really pleased that we also got to show the trailer of the film here at COP, and the minister herself introduced it, and she took full ownership of it. So she here, this is a session on where she was discussing climate finance and the role of the importance of including local people in this, like global policy. Yeah, and the role of adequate financing as well to properly address these issues. So here they were actually watching the film. They look like they are a bit tired and sleeping, but they were watching the screen just in front of them. So for the next 10 minutes, we are going to watch the film, and then we're going to have this really great discussion with these very fine people. Thank you.
Just stop share. One moment, hold on.
Madagascar's forests store carbon. They also contain species found nowhere else on Earth. Our country's precious heritage. Conserving these forests, or restoring them where they have been lost, can help in the globally important fight against climate change. Therefore, people living all over the world are discussing how to conserve these forests. These discussions affect the lives of local people, but these people often lack a real voice in the discussions.
Ny androtoko-piainanay zany aloha amin'izao fotoana dia mbola miankina amin'io atiala io zany ny fiainana, ny loharano aminaovana velotena anaty ala, ny trano nenanay dia anaty ala.
Tena mampanay ala dia ho taranaka eo aoriana raha ohatra potika eo aloha ny atiala.
Despite bringing benefits, forest conservation can also bring costs. These costs are borne by some of the world's poorest people.
Izahay taty zany zata velona morony ala sy ny velona tamin'ny atiala. Kanefa rehefa mba mipetraka toy ny fiarovany tony dia lasa tery le finanana.
Kanefa moa sasany tonga dia efa milaza mihitsy hoe rehefa tafiditra ao anatin'ny faritra rovana zany le tany dia efa mipetivirina miala bavo mihitsy zany aloha le izy satria tsy azo kitihina intsony zany.
Conservation projects often provide support to help people make a living without the need to clear forest. However, this has often been insufficient.
Tombotsoa mahakasika ny resaka fiarovana ala dia ny fahalalana izay hitanay tao anatin'ny fampianarana, fampiofanana sy ny torotoromarika madinidinika mba hahafahanay miatrika fiainana resaka velotena ato anatin'ny faritra rovana.
Ity le vahoaka ny tena be da be zany dia ohatrany hoe ny fahanandalitra fotsiny zany le vahoaka ireo zany aloha raha tamin'ny voalohany satria efa le fampanantenana azy ndrisana taminazy irery teo aloha zany dia tsisy tanteraka mihitsy aloha zany hatramin'izao.
Fa mampianatra an'ilay olona amin'ilay velotena dia manome masom-boly kely ohatrany hoe haricot-vert, courgette, karazana légumes zany ame zareo dia manome masom-boly vary zareo fa izy zany tsy dia hoe betsaka fa eo amin'ny 2 kilao ame zareo dia olona 2 kilao olona ray. Misy le tombotsoa kely.
Ilaina dia ilaina mihitsy aloha le fiofanana fa nefa kosa dia le teknika mpambolena ho azo ihany fa le tosika entina nanatanteraka le teknika mpambolena fa sarosarotra kokoa neny manao teknika mpamokara noho ny manao volonentim-paharazagny.
Many local people have insecure tenure over their land, and conservation has sometimes resulted in making this even less secure. If local people have rights over their land, they are more able to invest in improved farming techniques, conservation, and ecological restoration.
Mananjovy ianareo makasika an'le resaka fananantany sa tsy? Raha ny fahazahoako azy tompoko satria malagasy izahay, nanamainty milaly tany izahay, nipetraka efa mampolo taona teto izahay ary monina eto. Tokony amin'ny malagasy anay mba misy afaka misitraka ny zony fananantany izahay. Nefa moa ny lalàna moa zany tsy mazava aminay hoe atraiza ny ny zo anananay misitraka an'izay tombontsoa amin'ny fananantany zany satria faritra rovana moa zany le toerana.
Fa ny zavatra mampalahelo dia le olona any ivelany indray ny afaka ohatra manararoatra fa tsy le tsy fantatra hoe mahita anay le manaja any dia ila tsotana mihitsy zareo.
Raha misoratra aminay io tany io mariska izahay ny asa ary mariska izahay ny karakara sy kolokolo an'le tany. Fa ny zava-misy ange rehefa tsy voafaritra aminay ara-panjakana io tany io dia mifindrafindra. Ohatrany hoe mitady tany malemy andrenam-pangady izahay satria mahatsaro tena tsy tompony. Ny olona ety aminay zany aloha raha jerevana fotsiny raha amin'izao manodidina antsika izao dia hita fa mazoto ary manana riska ny mamboly hazo. Fa saingy fotsiny tsy makany amin'le resaka hazo ala zany izy raha eo amin'ny taniny. Miay azy zany izahay. So dia iverina ho any amin'ny fanjakana indray ny tany izay efa nometisanay milaly.
Raha sanatria zany izay no ataontsika hoe mitohy ka tsy ampy ny fandraisana andraikitra na tsy fanomezana andraikitra ny fokon'olona ny fotony dia horipaka ao anatin'ny folo taona tsy ho ela izay ataontsika hoe ala eto Madagasikara izay.
Atao hoe tompony nefa tsy tompony, atao hoe tsy tompony nefa tompony. Lasa fitaovana zany zay no tegna marina, lasa tompony mangatakatiny.
Empowered local people can help protect the forest, but they need support and a real voice in decisions about conservation.
Ny fanomezana zo fitipona ary zo fitantanana an'ireny rena voajanahary reny zany no hita hoe vahaolana akaiky ahafahantsika maparitra zany ataontsika hoe rena voajanahary zany eto Madagasikara.
Izay ho ampovoany amin'ny atiala mihitsy tsisy olona mahita an'izay ninina zany fa izay mahita ny mivoaka tsy miditra ao.
Zay ny miaro an'io ala io fotsiny hatra tamin'ny faharazam-benay dia tatoato zany nisy an'le mpiara-mimbona antoka. Dia ny mampalahelo zany dia ny fanjakana na ny mpamatsy vola dia mola mieritreritra foana zany reo olona manodidina ny atiala reo dia mieritreritra hoe mpanimba foana zany ny anaran'ireo.
Fa ny tena mahomby zany dia tena raisina amin'ny maha-olombelona azy le olona ny fotony olombelona manana andraikitra, olombelona manana jo, olombelona afaka misafidy, afaka manapaka zany zavatra rehetra zany. Rehefa raisina ohatran'izay izy dia tena lasa mpiara-miombona antoka tanteraka ao anatin'ilay fiarovana ary izay ny tena hoe antoky ny fahombiazana zany ho an'ny fiarovana ny tontolo iainana.
Over the last 3 decades, there has been a lot of effort aimed at conserving Madagascar's forests, but despite some real successes, forest loss continues. For tropical forests to fulfill their potential in contributing to the fight against climate change, lessons need to be learned about truly listening to and empowering local communities. Conservation and forest restoration that is equitable is more likely to be effective long term. International donors need to ensure sufficient investment to support local livelihoods and rigorous independent monitoring of the social impacts of conservation to ensure that it is both equitable and effective.
Dia taratra tokoa fa ireo mponina iny fotony dia tsy ary velively hoe tombontsoa azo tamin'ny asa fiarovana amin'ny ankapobeny. Tao anatin'izay no namoahana fa tsy maintsy avozina ireo fanarahana amin'ireny mpitantana faritra rovana ireny. Tafapetraka ankehitriny ny paikady ary eo indrindrandrindra no isarihana ireo mpiara-manatoka rehetrarehetra na amin'ny resaka fikarohana na ireo koa ireo tetikasa-panohana mba hanampy amin'ny fampiarana izay tetikady vaovao izay, satria io no hita fa lalana anotokana ahafahantsika tena miantoka an'ilay fiarovana, satria matoa tsy nandaitra hatramin'izay dia tsy voakajy ilay ataontsika hoe fandrindrana ny lafiny ara-tsosialy sy ekonomika an'ilay mponina sy ilay tena asa fiarovana ara-teknika siantifika nireny faritra rovana ireny.
Tokony avy any amin'ny sehatra rehetra, tokony misy famatsim-bola avy any amin'ny sehatra ohatrany hoe ny misahan'ny fambolena, ny fiompiana, ny jono. Raha ny mpanao tontolo iainana rery ihany foana no manao an'izy dia tsy vitany rery.
Ny mpamatsy vola moa any amin'ny sehatra iraisam-pirenena koa dia tokony hoe hijery ety amin'ny fotony mihitsy mba tsinjovina ihany ny ety amin'ny fotony hoe mba hatraiza sakafo ivelomany reto raha ohatra ka natao hiaro aly izy dia mino afa sambo mbola azo arovana tsara raha isisa tavelany anaty aly iny.
Marina zany tena ny olona mihitsy no tokony atao anivon'ny laharam-pahamehana zay vao mijery ny ala atsika. Fa raha vao tsy ny olona natao laharam-pahamehana voalohany dia tsy mety ny zavatra atao rehetra.
Tena miala ninona mihitsy zay mamboly zanak'azy. Tena marisy lahatra na mihitsy le miara-miasa amin'ireo mpiaro ala.
Thanks so much, Dan. So now we are going to start the panel discussion with three great people. So first, we have Bhaskar Vera from Cambridge University. So Bhaskar, can you tell us what is one theme that really stuck with you that you find most striking from this film?
Thank you very much. I was just very struck by the messages from the film, which resonate a lot. So I do a lot of my work in South Asia, and obviously at one level, it's a very different part of the world. But so many of the themes that the film is addressing are extremely familiar. The importance of real consultation and real inclusion of local people in projects that impact their lives has been something that has been a prominent theme in work in the Indian subcontinent and the wider South Asia region for 30 to 40 years. And in countries like Nepal in particular, the kind of commitment to genuine local empowerment potentially goes quite deep. And I guess one of the things I might want to return to, I don't want to kind of over-dominate that introductory remark, is that actually this process of consultation and participation lies across a spectrum. And at some point, it can be very superficial and very box-ticking. And at other levels, it can be a real deep commitment to giving local people voice, ownership, and control. And depending on where you are on that spectrum, I think these questions of local involvement are addressed in very different ways in different parts of the world. So I think the messages resonate. The importance of these issues is universal, but the extent to which they're actually being implemented does vary greatly across that spectrum.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bhaskar. And I'd like to follow up on that. So you said that the main issue is that like people's participation is just box ticking. So something you've got to do, and yeah, you can quickly get away with. So what are your thoughts? Like, how can this be improved? And yeah, like from your experiences and as a researcher, like yeah, or a researcher in this area.
So in my experience, it does require building trust between the participants in a program or a project. And sometimes that requires time. And I think what goes against both those is when a new project is trying to implement change in a very rapid way and wants to deliver results in a short time period. And there isn't enough time for the participants to learn to trust each other and learn to work with each other. And people are forced to adhere to often externally driven project completion deadlines. They might be driven by donors, they may be driven by other funders, and they don't necessarily have the space and the time to actually build relationships between the researchers, the implementing agencies, the local communities. And when they've been put together for the first time, they often don't trust each other. They don't know each other, and that's kind of understandable. So I would say that the pressures of externally determined deadlines don't always correspond with the pace at which social change happens. And that mismatch is often what's responsible. I wouldn't say that people from the outside are necessarily willfully ignoring local communities, but they have pressures on them from outside to complete projects within timeframes that might be incompatible with the pace at which social change needs to happen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bhaskar. That's a very wise insight. And so Julia Jones from Bangor University, who was actually involved in making this film. There is so much rhetoric about including local people in conservation. And we've heard a lot about it here at COP26, but still people like those that are featured in this film are very frustrated and they don't feel included, and forest loss is also ongoing. Why is this?
I don't know. I mean, I think in some cases, I think there's so much diversity and heterogeneity in this, as Bhaskar just alluded to. But I mean, if we think about the communities that were being interviewed in that film, they've lived through, you know, many different project cycles, kind of as Bhaskar referred to, and different efforts to implement conservation. And I think at the bottom line, they probably still feel poor. You know, they're still very poor. Like, conservation certainly hasn't just made their lives easier, and in some cases it's made their lives worse. But I mean, at some level, even just where it hasn't made their lives worse, it's just not made it easier, but they've constantly had a stream after stream of external projects coming through talking about lives being better. That might make things feel worse. So I think that is a real part of the problem in some countries and some situations. But then, of course, that film also alluded to the way that conservation can actually undermine people's feeling of security of their own tenure. I mean, the guy Dolimon, I think his name was, who's just so articulate about, like, do I own my land or not? You know, now it's a protected area. I don't even know if it's my land anymore. And, you know, he put that so beautifully. And I think that feeling of kind of suddenly there's external actors, you know, within their world, within Dolimon's world, he knows who has the power, you know, the traditional Fukunul and how the power resides there. But suddenly there's these external actors that are showing interest in their land and seem to also have power, and another set of rules seem to be applying to what they've always believed as the rules. And I think that can make people feel extremely excluded.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. So I'd like to come back slightly to what Bhaskar said and hear your thoughts. So Bhaskar told about the, you know, like the problem of like the motivations for us like researchers and also the conservation implementers. It differ from you know, like there are well-meaning efforts, but there are constraints that explain why this isn't working. So I'd like to hear your views on what's needed then to address this issue. Julia, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, I didn't think that was aimed at me. I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, I was slightly distracted. Rose, someone else, sorry.
Okay. So yeah, next we have Rose Pritchard, who is from the University of Manchester. Thank you so much, Rose, for joining us. So I know, Rose, that we've been working on forest restoration, and several countries have committed to very ambitious reforestation initiatives. And critical social scientists have suggested that, like these restoration goals risk extending the naive win-win narrative that's prevalent within conservation, that is conservation is always good for people and for the planet and for people's livelihoods. But then there is a risk that restoration also displaces local people in favor of large-scale tree plantations or natural regeneration. What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Sarobidy, and thanks for inviting me to participate today and for sharing the film. I think it's brilliant. It was really interesting to watch. I think part of the issue here is something we talked about in our discussion group yesterday, which is that the restoration banner is so big. There's so much that could fall underneath that. And if you start talking about things like nature-based solutions, you go up another level in terms of the things that could fall underneath that banner. And that's fabulous in terms of these things as kind of organizing concepts for environmental movements or as boundary objects for people working in different disciplines or different geographic spaces. It's not so great in terms of using them as kind of analytical concepts to understand what the social impacts might be. And I think that's why having kind of really in-depth mixed methods work to understand what's actually going on the ground is so fundamentally important. And I know there's quite a few people on this call today who are doing that kind of work, people like Ida and like Rebecca McLean. And it's brilliant to see that, because I think that's what moves us away from rhetoric on both sides, both that rhetoric of nature-based solutions are going to save the world and nature-based solutions are dreadful and are going to cause loads of harm and do nothing good for everybody, because neither of those are super helpful. But I'd also say with this kind of win-win stuff, there's this risk of conflating win-win with no trade-offs. And actually, I think kind of restoration efforts can produce multiple benefits. I think there are good examples where they have produced multiple benefits, but you still see that some people are not going to get the landscape that they want. And I think that really came through in your video, that even though there have been benefits for some, there have been losses for others. And I think that's why attention to process is so critical, and transparency of process is so critical. And also when we talk about we need to assess the social impacts of restoration, we need to think really carefully how we do that, because it's all very well looking at them in kind of aggregate terms or in quantitative terms, but then we really need to dig into the detail of how these projects interact with kind of dynamics of power, dynamics of inequality within communities, and who the winners and losers are in different contexts. So I don't think it's necessarily a naive win-win sort of situation, but I think adding more research and more really detailed social research to this is critical.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rose. So talking about research and also the film, so the importance of land rights in ensuring more effective and equitable restoration and conservation was a central theme in the film. So Rose, can you tell us what are your experiences on this, and how do you think we can better address this issue?
I mean, I have to admit, a lot of my work hasn't focused on rights-based approaches. I'm lucky to work with an amazing PhD student at the moment who is working specifically on this, and Danapal, who's in the audience today. So anything I say, I'm probably going to have learned from him. But I think India is a fascinating example for this in terms of rights-based approaches to forest management and the way that that has and hasn't worked within the Indian context. And I think also kind of ideas about rights, like there are examples of rights-based approaches that have backfired to an extent. So it sounds great in principle, but actually implementing them in practice does throw up challenges in terms of the kind of bureaucracy of that. The fact that as soon as you've put something on paper, you can lose that right. And so I think it's a fantastic idea, but the implementation is a challenge. And I defer to Bhaskar here because I think your expertise is going to be much more than mine.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I'd like to come back to that, what you said about the unintended consequences of, like recognizing people's rights, but definitely I'm sure Bhaskar is the expert here. So Bhaskar, we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Noon. I just thought I could sort of add some more, or at least from the Indian context, but also more generally about the question of land rights. So I think the important thing to recognize, and it came through really strongly in the film, is that rights can often be quite complex. So, you can have overlapping claims in spaces, and it may actually be possible for those overlapping claims to have recognition. So sometimes the kind of discussions around rights try and arrive at something which looks like a very clean version of rights claims that don't have overlap. The reality is that rights are actually quite often complex and negotiated. People might have temporal claims that intersect. So they may have seasonal access to certain parts of the forest, while the rest of the time, the forest is closed. And that's actually compatible with local access and land use patterns. Now, when, and this goes back to kind of, the history of colonial settlement in many parts of the world, where what the colonial forest settlement tried to do was to create these very kind of neat legal regimes over forests that were actually managed in quite complex and negotiated ways. So they wanted a binary of this is either protected or it's not protected. But actually, when you have these kind of overlapping regimes where you have seasonal access, where you have multiple claims, sometimes of neighboring villages that have sharing arrangements over certain types of forests in certain types of the times of the year, the actual rights have to be recorded in a much more subtle way. And I think there's continues to be in some of the rights literature, especially that, coming from sort of formal agencies, sometimes a desire for a clean, neat type of rights-based solution, when actually the reality is a lot more complex. So we need to recognize the complexity of those overlapping rights claims and find ways to record them in ways that pay attention to the manner in which local communities have been using the land and the forest surrounding their settlements. So I'd say that's one of the insights. Now, in the Indian case, there's been a really significant shift towards community forest rights, CFR as they're called, as well as the Forest Rights Act. And that records both individual tenure as well as community tenure in areas that might also have overlapping claims from the state. They may be reserved forests historically, they may be conservation areas that are being protected. And that subtlety is lost in the dialogue at the moment, because again, there is a desire to have one or the other. And actually, this is this kind of complex overlapping space, especially if we're trying to use forests for multiple uses. So, coming back to what you said, Rose, you can have multiple outcomes from forests that meet the interests of multiple stakeholders. I don't think that removes the fact that there are winners and losers. There will be winners and losers, but you can have multiple beneficiaries and you can have secure access to those benefits, which are enshrined in the framework of rights. And I think that's kind of a much more subtle approach to rights than just trying to say something simple like who owns this land. That's too simplistic a question. So wow. I'm sorry, that was a sort of slightly long and complex answer, but I think it is reflecting the complexity of the rights debate.
Yeah, and that's so helpful. Thank you, Bhaskar. I have a quick follow-up question on that. So do you know of any evidence that where, like this recognition of rights haven't worked well, and where it, you just said about the case study of India, where it seems to be positive, the experience is positive. But can you also tell us about how, where are the situations where this has made things worse and accelerate forest loss?
Well, not necessarily forest loss, but I mean, I'll point to an example, which I know that the recent paper that Rose, you and others were involved with kind of points to, which is the historic experience of tree planting efforts in India. And, you know, in that context, there's evidence that with secure property rights, private landowners planted the wrong types of trees in the wrong places. So you end up with an outcome in which tree plantation is taking place, but you're planting things like eucalyptus in very dry parts of India, which is having a detrimental impact on the water table. And those trees are effectively serving as cash crops for very rich farmers. So they're not actually achieving any environmental outcomes. So, but I mean, they're based on a secure property rights regime. Those landowners had complete secure rights over their land, but they were planting things for profit because that's what the market dictated. And at that time, there was a boom in terms of eucalyptus. So there was a huge extensive plantation boom on these private property holdings. So it kind of explains that the property rights solution didn't necessarily result in the ecological outcomes that we might have desired. And I know, Rose, your recent work is kind of focused on this. You might want to step in on this as well.
So I should say, I wasn't actually a co-author on that paper. I just wrote the commentary for it. So we need someone like Forrest Fleischman here for that one. Sorry.
Can you share with us what was that commentary about that you wrote? The commentary.
So I just wrote a short comment recently in Nature Sustainability on a paper that was led by Eric Coleman that was focused on forest or tree plantations in India and the fact that they don't actually produce much benefit as yet, at least in the study site where they were working. I'm not sure if any of the authors are on the call and could add more detail to that, but I think it was just a really nice illustration of the politics of tree planting, which is the bit that often gets missed out. And we shouldn't reduce restoration just to tree planting, but you have the same political concerns with any kind of restoration project. Because I think the risk with restoration is it's characterized as going back to a past state, at least, or reproducing whatever of a past state you can within the constraints of the change that's happened. But you can't go back socially, and you don't want to go back socially quite often. So you've got a completely new set of social circumstances, which means it's inevitably a political process of design. And that was the argument being made in that piece.
Oh, thank you. I really look forward to reading it. And Julia, I'm sure you've got a lot of things to say on that, on the importance of rights in the success of restoration.
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely not an expert on this, but I do think, I mean, I'm constantly, you know, we often talk about land tenure as being kind of key to everything, and everyone nods kind of earnestly and in strong agreement. But I do think that often we don't really know what we mean by when we say that, because as Asker says, you know, we can all recognise that rights are important, but whose rights to who for what time of year? It's not simple to actually even the systems, the kind of de facto systems that might be in place are often highly complex and, you know, context dependent, etc. And if there's any kind of external actor wanting to kind of come in and improve the way in which rights are recognised, etc., there's all sorts of potential for unintended consequences. So, you know, often conservationists, when we talk about the kind of work we've done, Sarobidy, in this film, they'll say, okay, so what's the solution? What's needed? And, you know, there's certainly no simple kind of, just make sure that local communities have got full tenure of the rights. So what does that mean? Is it communal tenure? Is it recognising private tenure? So for those that don't know the Madagascar context, there was a Land Reform Act in 2005 that recognised that people who don't have legal title for land can still own land, and it introduced a simpler process called certification, whereby people could get rights over their land that was recognised in their community as their private land. But that doesn't apply within the peripheries of protected areas or within protected areas. And given Madagascar has nearly all the forests we care about in the kind of conservation perspective are, you know, these are kind of patchwork mosaic landscapes around better forest, but those are all within peripheries of protected areas. So that certification law doesn't apply. So in that context, people are essentially barred. I mean, that's what they're saying in the film when it says conservation can sometimes undermine rights, because essentially if those weren't a protected area, they would be able to apply for not formal land title that goes through courts at national level, but this certification that goes through the commune, the local authority. But is that the answer? Is allowing community, individual private ownership of land within the periphery protected area, would that solve things? I mean, one guy, I think it was Dolliman again, he was so articulate. I think he said it in the film as well, that I think it was his point where he said, if we can own our land and be sure it's our land, then we can invest more in our land. So, he was very strongly making the argument that private land ownership would help intensify his agriculture on a small patch, so he doesn't need to keep moving around looking for fertile land. But there are arguments that more communal tenure would be appropriate. And of course, it's hugely context specific.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. So coming back to the film and the key themes. The international environmental and conservation policy and also the implementation world has been criticized for being dominated by rich Western voices. And it's hard for local communities to cut through. So Bhaskar, I'd like to ask you, is that changing, and how can it be improved?
I might turn it around because the two of you are at COP, and it would be interesting to see. But I mean, I have seen, of course, a lot of messaging in the media and in social media over the last week about the nature of access, the difficulties that many community voices have found in finding space at a global meeting like COP. I mean, obviously a COP is a sort of big and complex affair, so I wouldn't necessarily want to hold that up as the only place where these conversations can take place, but it is illustrative. Access is difficult. Reaching places like Glasgow is not easy if you're a local community leader in Madagascar and Nepal or in rural India. So I think the kind of ways in which people's voices are heard remains very difficult, because the forums in which these discussions are made, these discussions happen and these decisions are made are very inaccessible. There is better representation, I would say, that there are opportunities for people to represent local voices, but access remains really challenging. And then they obviously tend to feel that they're on the receiving end of decisions that are being made in remote places that they don't have access to. So how that is brought into conversation with local communities, how their concerns are properly articulated, taken notice of, rather than them being consulted on a decision that has already been made, is a real challenge. So I mean, I know there's a lot of focus on things like international conservation agreements, but how do you get a local perspective in early, at the start of that conversation, rather than a decision being made in some kind of global forum and then being communicated to? It always feels like, and this kind of goes back to 30, 40 years of writing in the development sector more generally, that development is being done to people rather than with people, that their participation is an afterthought to a decision that's already been made. That, we agree that something like REDD+ is a good thing to do, and then we try and work out how it can be made compatible with the interests of local people. But they're not there when the REDD+ decision was being made. They're not present in that conversation. And I think that remains a challenge.
And we recently made a big pledge. I'm coming to Julia. So we've made this big pledge on ending deforestation by 2030. How can this money be used, Julia? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I wanted to come back to Bhaskar's point about the being here at COP and the extent, he turned around it as a question really to us. And I think my perspectives have been kind of changing throughout the week on an almost hour by hour basis, actually, depending on which room I'm in when. I mean, I started the week feeling very positive because the very, very first event on the UK Pavilion was an event that Sarobidy actually chaired, and it was about learning the lessons of REDD+ over the last decade and the people speaking on it genuinely were. There was some Indigenous representatives, this amazing woman from Guatemala, and there was a Philippine Indigenous Peoples representative. There was a really quite a diverse panel, and it was a very frank discussion. And I mean, the Indigenous representative from, I think it was Guatemala, wasn't it? She actually made many of the same points that are in the film and was talking very frankly. And I thought, oh, this is fantastic. We're right on day one. We've got, you know, on the UK pavilion, the first slot there, and we've got these frank conversations where, you know, this woman, she was, you know, obviously someone who was comfortable and able to speak in this forum. Through, you know, she spoke in Spanish through a translator, but you could tell she came from the village. She came from the forest frontier. She really had come from there, and I thought that was very positive. But then I've been thinking more and more, well, there's very different conversations going on in COP, and where the powerful decisions are being made, I'm not necessarily sure that those voices are being heard. And I think the problem at this COP of observers not being able to attend the negotiations, I think, is a problem. So you've got the governments just having the discussions over the details of the agreements, and the government delegations might well involve civil society groups, in which case that's great. But many of the people that have come here on civil society tickets, so, you know, have the kind of badge I have, an observer badge. So, you know, I was meeting some Indigenous rights group yesterday who were really frustrated. We were trying to get into the same negotiation and couldn't get in because observers were banned. There was a kind of Feminists for Climate Justice representative trying to get in and weren't able to get in. So I think that is a problem. So though there's a lot of representation here of different interest groups, NGOs, campaign groups, I think it's a shame that they can't observe the negotiations.
Yeah, so Julia, I'm a member of the delegation from Madagascar, but as a researcher, although I have a badge party, this is my badge, I'm not allowed to speak either. So yeah, there is a problem here, and we definitely need to address that. So I guess we have like a few minutes left before we open the floor to the audience, which I'm sure has also a lot of questions. So Rose, can you share with us your final thoughts on what is needed for nature-based solutions, such as forest conservation and restoration, to succeed in a fair and inclusive way?
So I'm probably going to give a slightly unhelpful answer here, because I think part of what makes this question really hard is about who gets to decide what's fair and what's inclusive. And I think that there's a very good point made in the chat about who gets to define success, like who decides what a successful outcome actually looks like. And I've been working with some colleagues recently on these ideas around justice and restoration. And it's really difficult, particularly like, because justice firstly is context dependent. Everyone thinks a different thing is just. And then if you start getting into intergenerational justice, if you get into multi-species and the more than human, it's a really, really hard question. And I think it brings us back to that question about trade-offs. And I don't think there's a perfect answer, because actually I think the situation we're in is choosing between multiple, slightly imperfect solutions. And again, that's why that process is so fundamental, because that's where the winners and losers get figured out. And it's why we can't just focus on outcome. So I'm afraid I have no sensible suggestions for how to make these things fair. I think we just have to track their progress and adjust as we go, that kind of adaptive learning process.
No, that's totally sensible. Thank you, Rose. So Bhaskar, what are your final thoughts on this issue? What is one thing you'd really like to get across?
I'll pick up from where Rose sort of left off and just talk again about trade-offs. I think when people mention trade-offs in the context of many of these complex questions around conservation, restoration, and nature-based solutions, I think a recognition of trade-offs doesn't mean that we can eliminate trade-offs. And I think it's really important for people when we talk about trade-offs to understand that trade-offs will remain. Making them visible is probably the thing that I would talk about as the most important thing, because so many trade-offs remain hidden because people are not looking for them, or because the voices of those who are negatively impacted are invisible to those who are making the decisions. So what might come across then rhetorically as a win-win obviously has a hidden loss because somebody's voice is invisible to those who are making the decisions. So what I would probably sort of emphasize is that a focus on trade-offs doesn't mean that we're going to get rid of trade-offs. What we're going to be then forced into is to try and make a sensible decision over competing value perspectives competing imperatives and recognize that any policy choice that we make is a tough choice. Someone is going to win and others are going to lose. And you have to be comfortable with the moral outcomes and the social and economic outcomes that are going to emerge from those decisions, but it's not going to eliminate trade-offs. So if people are looking for eliminating trade-offs or an elusive win-win, I find that difficult. And I've often sort of said that it's difficult to imagine that those win-wins existed and people never thought of them. So if there was an easy win-win, somebody would have found it. In which case, maybe it's about recognizing that there are always going to be some winners, some losers, and then trying to understand whether that's a state of the world that we can live with. And everyone will have a different moral opinion about which winners are acceptable and morally correct and which winners are perhaps not. So, if the winners are, I don't know, I'll put my values out there, large profit-making companies, and the losers are small local communities, I'd find that a problematic outcome. But if you reverse that outcome, I might be more comfortable with it. It doesn't mean that I'm going to eliminate the trade-off. There will remain a trade-off, but there will be some trade-offs that my moral system is more comfortable with than others.
Yeah, thank you, Bhaskar. And Julia?
I mean, Bhaskar just put that so beautifully. So I'd like to just reflect a little bit then on the big commitment that we had on Tuesday from about 100 world leaders originally, and then it went up to about 120 signed this agreement, the Glasgow Leaders Pledge on Deforestation and Land Use to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. And I think that was maybe one of my lower points in my, as I said, I've kind of gone up and down and feeling positive and negative. And that was the point when I thought, okay, these are just very glossy statements, and I'm not hearing real acknowledgement of these issues in some of those discussions. But I think what was most interesting was when the day after the Leaders' Pledge was announced, when the Indonesian Minister for Environment posted on her Facebook page that she didn't think the agreement had actually meant stopping deforestation, because that would just be ridiculous in her country, because her country's development and cutting trees is a key part of development, and they're going to have to for even just road access into remote areas, and that she felt that the way it was being presented internationally was disobedience. That wasn't what she felt Indonesia had signed up to. And I thought that really kind of struck a chord that, even a kind of senior government person who was here at the conference and was involved in signing up to that pledge had a very different understanding. And she was raising the point, well, trade-offs. We have development needs, and a complete halt of deforestation just isn't in line with our national development objectives. And so sort of straight away that kind of, many of us were sceptical anyway whether it could be achieved, particularly coming on the back of the many pledges before, the New York Declaration of Forests, most recently in 2014. But I thought that was very interesting to hear that rolling back so suddenly after the Leaders' Declaration.
Okay, thanks so much, Julia. So I see there are 3 questions in the Q&A boxes. So let's address this first, and then we are going to ask the audience to also participate. So the first, so this is a comment from an anonymous person. So I'm just going to read it out loud. And Bhaskar is typing an answer. So sadly, this story is not new, and it's not unique to Madagascar. It's the same story, and it's pervasive all over African countries. Tons of years of research concurred and have stressed the importance of secure tenure and clear rights, as well as the need to use participatory approaches in defining the contours of conservation and restoration goals. Bhaskar, as you are answering, can you say it out loud, please?
I was just agreeing with the comment which I've just typed in, which is to say, yes, no, absolutely, it is. It's been reported much more widely. It's even not unique to Africa. It certainly resonates with the experience from South Asia, which is what I'm familiar with. But I know that from the literature, it resonates with experience elsewhere as well. So, and absolutely, these discussions have been in the published literature for at least 35 years, and of course, in practice on the ground for even longer. So, totally agree with that comment. the fact that it's not new, but it bears repeating is also interesting because, you know, maybe it's in different audiences. And so I wouldn't want that comment to be taken as any implied criticism of the work or the film. I think it's really important that we keep resonating these issues as much as possible. So the fact that it's not new doesn't undermine the need to keep repeating these messages. Sorry,
yeah. But what I was going to come in on is kind of it's Sarobidy kind of asked this question in one of her questions, but you know, this guy anonymous here, or lady, or whoever it is, says, you know, tons of years of research have stressed the importance of securing clear tenure as well as participation for conservation. But and again, like, this is something I think everyone, certainly on this call and probably in the wider listening people, would agree that tenure is important. But again, it comes down to that, what do we mean? So conservationists, you know, people coming from a conservation perspective will say, how can you say that conservation has opportunity costs because local communities need to be able to clear land, but also say you need to give all the rights to local communities because surely then they would clear land? And I'd like to hear, you know, Rose or Bhaskar or Sarobidy kind of address that contradiction. I think that's useful because I do think that's something that conservationists will often ask of people who promote devolution of rights to communities or even private tenure to individuals at the community level. Who wants to come in? Sarobidy, do you want to have a go at that one? You have to unmute though. Unmuted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, Julia, so you were talking about the contradiction between giving people or recognizing people's rights and also the fact that it might not always lead to the desired outcomes. Is that what you are saying?
Yes, I'm thinking from the perspective of so, you know, you could argue for people's rights from a purely rights-based perspective, not from an instrumental kind of perspective, not that, you know, you could argue that rights are rights and therefore it's regardless what the outcomes are. But you could also argue, and certainly what you're hearing in environmental policy terms and in kind of certainly in conservation circles, is the idea that they're interested in rights because of the idea that that might lead to better conservation outcomes. But what about where it doesn't lead to conservation better outcomes? I guess that's my question. And I don't know whether you or Rose have something to say on that.
I think Bhaskar has touched on that earlier when he discussed that it's quite complex, and there is now like black and white answers to when it comes to property rights, yeah. So I think it's as I said, it's very related to this next comment we have actually in the Q&A box, which says that you know, like incentives should not always be focused on cash or money. There are more that are valued by local communities, and alternative livelihoods might not be desired. So why not ask local people what alternatives they prefer instead of deciding on their behalf? So the way I understand this comment is that sometimes, so these local communities that live on the forest frontier, they are like the nearest to this forest, and they have the biggest potential to influence what happens over the forest. And I think it's just fair and just. But of course, as Rose said, that what's just is actually it differs from one person to another one. That we actually let these people decide what's best for them, and this has actually been the critique of you know, like scholars writing on colonial conservation and the problems with it. So I'm just really talking a lot. Sorry. I think I'm gonna ask Rose maybe to comment on that.
I think it's a really interesting tension, and it's one I definitely struggle with in my work, the idea of rights as instrumental versus rights as what people should have because they are people, and therefore it should be fundamental. And I think what makes this more difficult is actually a positionality thing, like particularly, I'm from the UK, we're one of the most deforested countries in Europe. And then we go into other places and talk about maintaining forest cover, and that's difficult. And again, if you have people who live much higher consumption lifestyles going into other countries and saying, well, you can't cut down forests. And I think it comes back to being that very moral question about who should be taking action, what kinds of action should they be taking. And again, I don't think there's a simple answer to this one. I think it is a really, really hard one. And it's one I certainly haven't resolved, and I don't think anybody has.
Yeah, you're totally right.
I mean, my comment in response to Julia's question would be that it's obviously not a silver bullet. Just giving local people rights isn't going to fix the problem. You have to understand what their structural constraints are in terms of the decisions that they can make with the rights that they've been given. So, the choices of land use are shaped by what they perceive as productive possibilities, market opportunities, and they will make, from their perspective, decisions that secure or promote their livelihood options. Those won't always coincide with the outcomes that the conservation community wants. And this is what might set up the trade-off. And then there's a choice to be made, which is this conservation outcome important enough to override local rights? Or is this a conservation outcome that can be sacrificed because the local rights are more important? That's the choice that people would then have to make. And there's no silver bullet to avoid that choice. In circumstances where there is an explicit trade-off between what local people might choose to do, if you give them the right, and what the conservation community desires them to do. And I think we have to confront that reality. It's not going to be easy. Are you willing to give up a certain conservation outcome because the rights matter more?
Thank you, Bhaskar. That's so well said. So I think I can answer the next question by Leigh Fox. So he's asking, do we know if the conservation activities described in the film are being monetized, and whether the local communities are getting an equity share in monetary benefits? Yeah, so that's a really good question, and something that we really want to highlight in the film, that local people, local communities, despite the benefits that forest conservation such as policies such as REDD+ can offer, they get sometimes this money, the carbon revenue, doesn't reach these local communities. So in Madagascar's case, this hasn't really happened on the ground. And as the lady in the film said, there has been some help. They've got like 1 kilo of rice and some vegetable, and that was it. That was almost like nothing. So yeah, to keep it short, the answer is no. Unfortunately, no. Yeah, first, it hasn't even reached them, and second, yeah, even if they were given some help, yeah, it's nothing compared to the cost that they are actually bearing from the restrictions imposed by conservation. Yes, Julia.
Can I come in there as well? Yeah. So, yeah. Leigh Fox, I think I don't know whether I fully understand your question, because it seems that you're conflating being monetized into, are they getting an equity share in monetary benefits? So the carbon, just because it's carbon benefits doesn't mean it reaches them as money. I'm not sure if I fully understood your question. So the funding, so yes, there is carbon credits. There has been some carbon credits sold from Madagascar. And the idea was for that the benefit sharing agreement was in place. The discussions going on at the moment, in fact, the discussions here about Article 6 at COP kind of put a stop to that, because the specific REDD+ projects, the government put a stop on them selling carbon credits because they wanted to make it part of their jurisdictional REDD project that would be part of their nationally determined contribution. So currently there's no carbon money flowing into Madagascar. There has been a REDD+ agreement signed and the money should start flowing soon. But the money that's been arriving so far has been linked to international benefits. Conservation organisations have invested and tried to make conservation happen because of carbon benefits and biodiversity benefits, but it certainly hasn't been given out as money. It's been spent on local development projects. I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Yeah, so I'm gonna read the next question from Pablo Prado Cordova, but please, yeah, you can just, also raise your hands, and yeah, you can directly ask a question. So the question from Pablo is a bit complex, I must say. So he asked, how do we change the playing ground so as to come up with a non-utilitarian metric for gauging benefits and costs in a way that opulence and subsistence aren't deemed as quality valid? So who wants to answer that? Maybe Royce or Bhaskar or Julia? Yeah.
It sounds like there's a little bit of a sort of economics question in there, so I might tackle it first. And
yes, please.
I guess sort of if we start with the question around the utilitarian metric for gauging benefits and costs. I mean, I guess, what you're trying to come up with is something that doesn't. So when we talk about trade-offs, the currency in which trade-offs are often measured can be seen as money. And I think what a utilitarian metric results in is that money is equal. A dollar is a dollar. It doesn't matter whose dollar. But obviously, what you're talking about in the context of opulence and subsistence is that $1 to a billionaire is worth a lot less than $1 to somebody who's earning $1.90 a day. So the same dollar used as a unit of currency as a trade-off metric doesn't necessarily represent the same thing to different people. So we have a metric in which effectively a monetarily poorer person can be bought out by somebody who's very wealthy, because the value of money is different to them. What is missing is the non-monetary benefits, or a non-utilitarian metric would be one which says, well, there are things that we cannot reduce to the equivalent of a money metric. It's about customary access, it's about community tenure, it's about spiritual and other ways in which you might value a certain land or a landscape, which is not a utilitarian engagement between people and the land. And if we can provide a way in which that is recognized, given recognition in the language of benefits and costs, then you can't buy those out. You can't buy out somebody's ancestral land because of the kind of deep spiritual and cultural connection that they might have. So there is no monetary value that is an equivalent. So you then are back in terms of saying, okay, on the one hand, and we get into a kind of complex trade-off, which says, on the one hand, this community is losing access to an ancestral land which they've occupied for 1,000 years. On the other hand, there's this large benefit that is being made by a mining company. How do we decide that trade-off, right? And you can't use money metrics to reconcile that. So you're actually back into making decisions, weighing up the pros and cons, the benefits and costs, but not using the same metric. So you want to have a space in which that conversation can take place, and not reduce everything to a single unit in which trade-offs can be negotiated, because that's inappropriate in some cases. But yeah, I often say that we do this all the time. Sorry, just to complete, just to kind of use an analogy that might help. I often talk about a dashboard. If you drive a car, you look at your dashboard, and we are able to use multiple sources of information to make decisions. So I'm looking at the speed at which I'm driving. I'm looking at how much petrol is left in my car. I'm looking at a whole range of other things on my dashboard and weighing them up as a decision maker in charge of this vehicle. So it's not difficult for us to have multiple things that inform our decision, which are not reducible to the same metric. I don't have a single figure on my dashboard. I've got multiple figures on my dashboard, which allow me to make decisions. So I think we can use that kind of analogy to think about, we can weigh different things which are not reconcilable in the same metric in order to make decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Bhaskar. That's a very nice analogy. So Royce, I heard you want to jump in here.
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to be repeating some things that Bhaskar's already said, because I agree completely. But I think it's why, I'm thinking from a restoration context again, I think it's why it poses a really fascinating methods challenge. because you want to do comparative analyses across sites and you want to understand what's working and what isn't. But then how do you take into account these really local situated values? Kind of how do you take an almost external approach to impact assessment that tries to quantify things and understand them in the same terms versus, and we're going back to classic development studies stuff about people having the choice about the lives that they want to lead and the freedom to live the lives that they value. And actually kind of thinking about how you compare different approaches in different places, those values are so important, but they're very hard to come up with some sort of approach that will work in multiple different locations. And I think that point about how do we get past subsistence and into thinking about things like prosperity and dignity and people having pride in the lives that they're living, it means, yeah, the mixed method stuff and bringing in the qualitative, really localized understandings as well.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. And
I was going to say there are some really interesting comments coming in the chat as well. So I think some people have access to, you've seen them, great, perfect.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Sailaja, sorry if I'm not saying correctly your name. You wrote some very interesting comments. Can you please say them out loud? If you can, you actually switch on your mic and directly speak. I'm actually looking for you in the list of participants. Oh, okay. I need to authorize you. Okay. Yeah. Yes, please. It's permitted. Talking is permitted.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Quite a wonderful discussion. Thanks to all the panelists first. And I just wanted to share my surprise, and also it's kind of a a very interesting thing to see that people in Madagascar are very much thinking like some of my respondents in India. Recently, I completed a project where we compared 3 states through qualitative ethnographic mixed methods approach. And the points that were raised in the video by the people are very much similar to the points that my respondents also raised. For example, they were talking about how they are not able to go for native species, despite knowing that the native species would give them longer term security, because they simply do not have the trust factor, which also Bhaskar Veera mentions, that it's very important, of course. So they don't trust the forest departments in several contexts that I am referring to. Hence, their choices of non-native species, which are also likely to give them quick buck. That is one aspect which I found very interesting to look at the parlance. And the other aspects include the migrants coming from middle Indian states like Chhattisgarh, and the different parts of middle India, landlocked India, and coming into the other states, Orissa, Andhra, Maharashtra, and other Gujarat, and so many other, West Bengal, so many other places. And these outsiders, the so-called outsiders for the respondents we interacted with, are then clearing these forests very fast and very quickly, with a lot of violence, which is not being, the locals are not able to respond to that kind of violence. So it's much more complex how rights are viewed by the locals and how they are contested by a non-local, because the non-local says, I'm from the same, if not exactly the same clan, I do belong to these clans. Just because my ancestors migrated a few, decades back, why should I be deprived of my, rights to this particular land which they cultivated? So the rights approach, as Bhaskar pointed, is extremely, fluid in our context, and exactly that is the biggest problem we are facing. And the other thing that I also wanted to know from the documentary makers here, Julia and Sarobidy, if I am understanding right, and the others who are part of this, whether the conflict between individual rights and the community rights, the conflict of interest in India right now, what I have observed from my exposure to some of these states is that the individual forest rights are being preferred by the local politicians because they are then able to couple the cash handouts and other kinds of things to individual rights holders, so that the individual right holders then give their vote to these political parties. Whereas the collective rights and the collective commons are not so fetching for these politicians, and of course for other neoliberal reasons. So the context is pretty complex, but the parlance is significant, and it's I find it slightly reassuring. I mean, at the risk of sounding negative, I would, I'm actually able to see the issues and the concerns are very much similar across continents, and that is very fascinating to observe. I wouldn't know what is the solution for all these things, and I wouldn't believe that there is a solution. I completely agree with you people. It's just that we have to go step by step and try and adjust as many puzzles as we can while going ahead. Just a sharing of experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sailaja. And yeah, just talking from my experience, I think one of the solutions, so it's not really a solution, but a step in the process is, making some efforts, especially from us as researchers in engaging with policy. So us, we are in this Forest for Climate and People project. We are like 60% trying to deliver impact, and we are still doing some research, like 40%. And I can honestly say that the policy part is so challenging. I'd rather really write papers and get myself locked in a room and write papers than engaging with these policymakers. But these are so needed. I think we just need to go the extra mile really, and just make every effort to communicate these research results to these policymakers that can do things and can change the way these policies are designed so that they are addressing these issues better.
Right.
Yeah, so we have one hand raised in the...
I think Dan might have a question. Yeah, I think Dan might have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I do have a question. Hi, thank you so much for this terrific and very rich discussion. It's about a film. And one thing that's interesting to me would be to hear your reflections about the process of making the film, whose voices were included and the choices. I mean, there was talk of migrants, for example, that weren't necessarily featured. Who are these people? I think for Flair, film can be really powerful. I mean, look at the discussion that it's generating here. And the comparison, I think it just forms a basis to kind of, for people to grapple. And I'm thinking of, a US context, what land rights and stakeholders and things like that. So it's very powerful, but I wondered if those that were involved in the making of the film could reflect on just some of the lessons and complications that there were in doing it. The broad value of it could be something that the other panelists could reflect on as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I can definitely share my experience. So as I said, it was quite challenging. So these people that we selected to be interviewed to feature in the film. So these are people that we've worked with. Like I've worked with 4 years. So these are like villages where I did my fieldwork for my PhD, as well as subsequent research I did for my postdoc. So I've developed, some bonds, and I've developed trust with these people. So that made it, easier to, get to talk to them openly about these challenges and gain their trust that they're not going to. There's nothing they need to be afraid of by speaking openly on these issues. So we had the first cut of the film, a first draft, and we also wanted to really engage the policymakers. So we reached out to them and we told them, look, this is a field that brings local voices, and really wanted to also like have ownership. They looked at it and they, saw the negative stories, and they were like, no, we've got to delete this and this and this and this, get rid of all the negative stories. If you do that, then you are going to encourage the people who are clearing the forest in the south of Madagascar. So at that time, we had like a very serious forest loss in the region of Mena Bay in the south of Madagascar, and they were like, no, we are the ministry, we cannot comment such film. We've got to just get rid of this and this. So that's when the long negotiation started, and we were just very patient. We engaged in very open dialogue, trying to convince them that look, this is the reality. We all know that this is the what's currently happening on the ground. So we've got to get all these thoughts, how uncomfortable they are, and eventually it worked. So they wanted to also have their voices in the film. So that's where the director of environmental governance intervened. So he wanted to say also about what the government is already doing to tackle this issue. This is how it worked. It wasn't easy at all to get at the final cut that can be actually used and owned by policymakers. But it was a long process, to be honest. Like we spent like a whole year just making this film. But eventually it's so rewarding.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that because it was so critical. It was so critical that the government owned this film, like for us and conservationists. For us, if it was just a film with villagers going, nah, we don't like this, this is the problem. Then the only audience for the film is people like us who know those problems. For us, it had to be shown by government. It had to be used. We wanted it to come here to COP. We needed government to own the film. And so all our dreams came true when the minister herself introduced the film at this climate finance event that wasn't even focused on communities, but she brought the communities into that climate finance event and talked about them and sent us a text afterwards saying how appreciative she was to hear. She was so pleased to have the opportunity to bring their voices to COP. So to us, it was critical to get that, but we could only have got that if we had done that negotiation. I mean, Sarobidy led on that. And in the end, we didn't take out any of the negative stories. All we did was replace one of the NGO voices with the government voice and gave them enough space to say they are trying to tackle it. But there's one other point I want to make, which is that there was this little thing called COVID, which kind of got in the way of our plans making this film, which meant that the film crew were based in northern Madagascar. Most of the team and most of the field work we've done is in the east of Madagascar. And the film crew, we had permission for them to travel, even between lockdowns, there were regional travel bans. But then the region where the communities went into the second lockdown, and we never got the film crew in the same place as our team. And in the end, our team couldn't go back to the field to do the filming that they wanted to do either. So essentially, all of the interviews you see in the film are done not by the professional filmmakers, just by our team that had been doing some preliminary interviews to help us think how the film could be. So, there was also just logistical challenges in terms of, but we were really pleased with the interviews that were done because they did capture the full range of the themes that we were hoping to illustrate in the film based on the research that Sarobidy and her team have done. And I do want to just acknowledge that Manu, Rakotonarivo Arvelu, I've noticed she's one of the participants. She was critical in making this film. So she's one of the key filmmakers.
Yeah, and she's here as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to, I think as part of Flair, and I'll invite everyone here, obviously, to wrap up session, to think about the role of film in communicating, well, as a research strategy, as an engagement strategy for different audiences. And it's great to learn from your experience in doing that. We'd love to follow up. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan, for the opportunity to speak at this meeting. And yeah, I see that there is one last question, maybe. So, Lee, what do you want to show with this link, cardboard? Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I think we can look at it later. But I just want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me, or are we done?
Yeah. We can hear you, but it's there is some background noise. Maybe it's easier if you can just write in the box.
Yeah.
Also, I think Ida written in the comment earlier that they wanted to speak. I don't know if Ida still wants to speak.
Yeah, so I think we have we have to wrap up. We have like 2 minutes left. So I'd like to thank you all so much. Oh, you also have a short film. Okay, we'll definitely check it out. Thank you, Lee. Okay, yeah, we have 2 minutes left to wrap up, and I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us today. And I guess my little summary on this is that in the airline industry, where they make the most minor failure of safety procedures, they look very closely at what went wrong. And I think this is what I'd like most to see from, this COP conference. Like we need to also to learn from our failures, and I'd really like to see more recognition also of past failures, and more recognition of these trade-offs, as Bhaskar just said. Yeah, we hope that yeah, this is a process. Yeah, we're just doing our tiny bit. There are lots of talks, and we are just like really hoping that the leaders will follow through, and the money is actually being spent on like addressing the issues that were raised in the film. Yeah, so thanks so much. I don't know if Julia, you have some final words you'd like to share.
That was a wonderful sum up. Thank you. And Ida is saying that they don't need to speak. They just were happy that their comments were addressed. Okay, fantastic. They made the first 2 anonymous comments. Great. All right. Fantastic. Thanks, Ida. I'm glad you felt answered.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you, Bhaskar and Rose, especially, and Tanya as well.
Thank you for inviting me. There are some invitations you can't say no to, and this was one of them.
I learned so much. I learned so much from you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.